Before sunrise, the shoreline north of San Francisco disappears beneath cold gray fog. The water is silent except for distant ferry horns echoing across the bay. And standing against that silence is a fortress of aging concrete and steel that has shaped California's criminal justice system for more than 170 years. This is San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, still known to most Americans by its historic name, San Quentin Prison. From a distance, it almost looks frozen in time. Tower walls rise beside the water. Narrow windows overlook the bay. Floodlights cut through the morning haze. But behind those walls are men serving some of the harshest sentences in the United States. And among them are inmates sentenced to death by the state of California. That reality confuses many people. California has not carried out an execution since 2006. In 2019, Gavin Newsom announced a moratorium on executions, effectively pausing the death penalty during his administration. The execution chamber was shut down. Planned executions stopped. Yet death row still exists. So why are condemned inmates still housed here? Why maintain a prison system built around executions that are no longer happening? And what does life become when a man spends decades waiting for an ending the state may never carry out? The answer begins with the prison itself. San Quentin opened in 1852 during the California Gold Rush era, when the state was expanding rapidly and crime rates were rising just as fast. Officials wanted a secure location close to San Francisco, but isolated enough to prevent escapes. The site along the bay provided exactly that. Water surrounded much of the property, and transportation by boat made moving prisoners easier in the 19th century. Over time, the prison evolved into something larger than a correctional facility. It became a symbol of punishment in California. Generations of inmates passed through its gates. Some eventually returned to society. Others never left alive. And inside San Quentin, one area became more feared than any other: death row. The prison's execution history stretches back nearly a century. California installed a gas chamber at San Quentin in 1937. Decades later, the state transitioned to lethal injection. Every execution carried out in California since then has taken place inside this prison. The execution chamber itself remains hidden deep inside the prison's adjustment center. The room is not dramatic. It is controlled, clinical, deliberate. A gurney sits beneath bright lighting. Restraints wait at the wrists and ankles. Witness windows separate observers from the procedure room. The design reflects procedure rather than emotion. Every movement inside was once governed by detailed protocols and legal documentation. And even now, despite the moratorium, the chamber still exists. The equipment was never fully removed. The legal authority to execute inmates still remains on California's books. That distinction matters, because the execution stopped, but the sentences did not. Inside San Quentin, condemned inmates historically lived in East Block, one of the prison's oldest housing units. Built in 1927, the structure rises multiple stories high, lined with narrow tiers and aging steel bars. The cells are small, measuring only a few feet across. Enough space for a metal bunk, a toilet, a sink, and a small desk attached to the wall. For some men, that space became their world for decades. Every morning begins the same way. Lights activate before dawn. Correctional officers perform count procedures with strict precision. Each inmate must stand visibly inside a cell, while officers confirm identities against official rosters. On death row, accountability is absolute. Every inmate is under a sentence legally ending in execution, even if that sentence remains suspended indefinitely. After count clears, breakfast trays move through the tier. The slot opens. The tray slides inside. The slot closes again. Then the silence returns. Life on death row operates through repetition. Meals arrive on schedule. Recreation time is limited and controlled. Showers are escorted. Movement is monitored constantly. Conversations travel through concrete, steel bars, and narrow walkways. But the harshest part of death row is not always the physical confinement. It is the waiting. In many prisons, Inmates count down years toward release dates or parole hearings. On California's death row, time works differently. Appeals stretch across decades. Legal motions move slowly through state and federal courts. Automatic reviews, habeas petitions, procedural challenges. The process can consume an entire lifetime. Some inmates die of natural causes before their appeals ever conclude. Others grow old waiting for court decisions that may never arrive. Imagine spending 20 or 30 years in a small concrete cell knowing your official sentence is death, yet having no certainty whether the state will ever enforce it. That uncertainty changes people. Some inmates cope by creating routines. Push-ups in the cell. Reading law books for hours each day. Watching television news cycles shift year after year. Others study legal procedure obsessively, becoming jailhouse lawyers who help fellow inmates navigate appeals. Inside death row, legal knowledge becomes survival. A successful appeal could overturn a conviction, reduce a sentence, or force a retrial. Newly discovered evidence, ineffective legal representation, procedural violations. Every detail matters. Entire lives can depend on paperwork filed decades after the original crime. But even when executions are paused, the psychological weight never fully disappears. Because a moratorium is not abolition. Politics can change. Governors change. Courts change. Public opinion changes. And every inmate on death row understands that possibility. When Governor Newsom announced California's execution moratorium in 2019, many outside observers assumed the death penalty had effectively ended. But legally, that is not what happened. The governor halted executions during his administration. He closed the execution chamber temporarily, but he did not overturn existing death sentences. He did not dismantle death row, and he did not remove the legal framework allowing future executions. A future governor could potentially restart the process. That leaves California trapped between two realities. Executions are not occurring, yet the machinery of execution still exists. More than 600 condemned inmates once remained under active death sentences even after the moratorium began, making California home to the largest death row population in the United States. And that raises a difficult question. If the state does not intend to carry out executions right now, why continue housing inmates under death row conditions at all? Part of the answer is legal, part is political, and part is symbolic. For prosecutors and some victims' families, the death sentence represents society's strongest condemnation of irreversible crimes. California voters have repeatedly debated abolishing capital punishment entirely, yet statewide repeal efforts have narrowly failed multiple times. So the system remains suspended, not fully active, not fully abandoned. And inside San Quentin, men continue waking up every morning beneath that uncertainty. Some inmates isolate themselves completely. Others maintain contact with family through letters and monitored phone calls. A few withdraw so deeply that days begin to blur together. Because when every year feels temporary, but the temporary never ends, time itself starts to feel distorted. And behind the aging walls of East Block, beneath layers of rusted steel and cold concrete, that uncertainty becomes part of daily life. Not freedom, not execution, just waiting. At 5 a.m., the first official count begins inside San Quentin Rehabilitation Center. The prison is still dark when correctional officers move through East Block carrying flashlights and printed rosters. Fog from the bay presses against the outer walls. Metal gates groan open and shut somewhere deep in the building. Then, the order travels down the tier. Stand for count. One by one, condemned inmates step toward the front of their cells. Hands visible. Face forward. Silent. Inside prison walls, count is sacred. If numbers fail to match, the facility locks down immediately. But on death row, the procedure carries additional weight. Every man housed there lives under a sentence that legally ends in execution. The state tracks each inmate with absolute precision. Once count clears, breakfast trays move through the tier. Oatmeal, powdered eggs, milk cartons. The food slides through narrow slots in steel doors before the openings shut again with a metallic slam. For some inmates, this exact routine has repeated for 30 years or more. And over time, repetition becomes its own kind of punishment. Death row inside San Quentin operates differently from most prison housing units in America. Movement is restricted. Recreation schedules are controlled. Conversations echo through steel and concrete instead of open yards. But the most powerful force inside East Block is not violence. It is uncertainty. Most inmates serving long prison terms still measure time toward something. A parole hearing, a transfer, a possible release date. Men on death row often live without any meaningful timeline at all. Appeals move slowly through California's legal system. Very slowly. Every condemned inmate automatically receives review by the California Supreme Court. After that comes state habeas corpus petitions. Then federal review. Then additional procedural challenges that can continue for decades. The process is so overloaded that some inmates wait years simply to receive qualified appellate attorneys. During that time, nothing changes. The sentence remains active. The cell remains the same. And the man continues living in a place originally built for execution. That waiting shapes behavior inside East Block. Some inmates become obsessed with legal research. Law books pile across small metal desks. Court opinions are studied line by line. Legal motions are handwritten carefully, sometimes over months. Inside death row, knowledge becomes currency. Understanding procedure can mean the difference between a sentence being upheld or overturned. Other inmates withdraw completely. Some stop communicating with family. Some refuse recreation periods. Some pace endlessly inside their cells, walking measured patterns across concrete floors to preserve a sense of control. Psychological survival becomes deeply personal. And after enough years, even time itself begins to feel distorted. The building contributes to that feeling. East Block is old, very old. The walls carry decades of scratches, faded names, and hidden tally marks buried beneath layers of paint. Plumbing rattles constantly through the structure. In summer, the air becomes hot and stale. During winter, damp cold settles into the concrete as fog drifts inland from the bay. Former correctional officers have described the environment as frozen in routine. Everything repeats. Nothing truly changes. And yet tensions inside death row never fully disappear. Communication between inmates remains constant, even under strict supervision. Men shout through bars. Messages travel during recreation movement. Legal updates spread rapidly through the unit. If a court ruling changes death penalty procedures anywhere in California, inmates often hear about it within hours. Hope on death row usually arrives as paperwork. A new appeal, a procedural delay, fresh DNA testing, a court decision questioning evidence or trial conduct. But hope can become dangerous when it collapses. When appeals fail after years of waiting, the emotional impact can be devastating. Some inmates become withdrawn and silent. Others react with anger. A few eventually accept that they may die inside prison regardless of whether executions resume. And for many inmates, the hardest hours arrive late at night. After final count clears, East Block quiets down. Televisions hum faintly behind bars. Some inmates read beneath dim lighting. Others lie awake, staring at the ceiling, while the sounds of the prison slowly fade into silence. Those quiet hours force reflection. Some replay their crimes repeatedly in their minds. Others revisit courtroom testimony, sentencing hearings, or final conversations with family members. A few imagine alternate lives that will never happen outside prison walls. Because on death row, the future feels permanently uncertain. If California never resumes executions, many inmates will likely die of illness or old age inside prison. If executions eventually restart, their names may once again move toward active execution lists. Either possibility remains legally possible, and that uncertainty affects the entire institution. For correctional officers, supervising death row requires constant discipline and emotional distance. Every movement follows procedure. Every use of force receives documentation and review. Officers working East Block understand that any incident involving condemned inmates may later appear in legal filings or public scrutiny. Professionalism becomes essential. Personal opinions about the death penalty stay private. Yet even staff members feel the psychological weight of the environment. Some older officers witnessed executions before California halted them in 2006. They described the process as controlled and clinical rather than chaotic. There were checklists, medical confirmations, timed procedures, witness protocols. Nothing was improvised. Everything was deliberate. And although younger officers may never witness an execution at all, they still train for the possibility because the legal authority remains intact. That lingering possibility shapes life inside San Quentin even now. In recent years, California began changing some of its death row policies. Historically, condemned inmates remained heavily segregated from the general prison population. But legal challenges argued that automatic isolation based solely on death sentence status raised constitutional concerns. Gradually, some condemned inmates were transferred into less restrictive environments. A few received work assignments. Others gained limited programming opportunities. Some even began interacting with inmates serving life sentences without parole. Those changes altered prison dynamics significantly. For decades, death row inmates existed almost entirely apart from the rest of the prison system. Now that separation has slowly weakened, and that shift raises difficult questions. What happens when a man sentenced to death works in a prison library helping other inmates with legal research? What happens when condemned inmates begin participating in educational programs or tutoring literacy classes? The line between death row inmate and lifelong prisoner starts becoming less clear. For victims' families, those changes can feel deeply unsettling. Many believe the death sentence represented permanent separation and maximum punishment. Seeing condemned inmates integrated into broader prison life sometimes creates anger and confusion. If executions are unlikely, what exactly is the punishment now? California itself appears divided on the answer. Some residents continue supporting capital punishment as the ultimate sentence for severe crimes. Others argue the system is expensive, ineffective, and morally flawed. Court challenges over wrongful convictions, prosecutorial misconduct, and forensic errors have only intensified the debate. Meanwhile, San Quentin remains caught in the middle of that uncertainty, not fully operating as an execution prison, not fully abandoning its execution role either. And inside East Block, the men living beneath death sentences continue adapting to a reality built around waiting. Waiting for appeals. Waiting for political change. Waiting for court decisions. Waiting for a future no one can clearly define. Because inside San Quentin, death row is no longer only about execution. It is about suspension, a place where punishment continues every day, even while the final sentence remains paused indefinitely. Deep inside San Quentin Rehabilitation Center, beyond secured corridors and reinforced doors, sits a room that California has not used in years. The execution chamber remains quiet. The gurney is still there. The witness area still exists behind thick glass. And although the state has not carried out an execution since 2006, the room has never fully disappeared from the prison system. That detail defines modern San Quentin more than anything else. The prison no longer actively executes inmates, but legally it still can. And as long as that possibility remains, the prison continues operating under the shadow of a sentence California has never fully abandoned. For the men housed under death sentences, that distinction matters every single day. A moratorium is temporary. Abolition is permanent. California chose the first option, not the second. When Gavin Newsom announced the statewide moratorium in 2019, the decision immediately halted executions and closed the execution chamber. Newsom cited concerns involving fairness, racial disparities, wrongful convictions, and the enormous financial cost of capital punishment. But the announcement did not erase existing death sentences. It did not dismantle the legal framework authorizing execution. And It did not prevent a future governor from reversing course entirely. That uncertainty leaves California trapped in an unusual legal position. Hundreds of inmates still carry official death sentences, yet no executions are actively scheduled. The machinery remains intact, but the process itself stands frozen. Inside San Quentin, condemned inmates live beneath that contradiction constantly. For some prisoners, hope comes from believing executions may never resume. Years pass. Governors change. Public opinion shifts. Court challenges continue. The longer the moratorium lasts, the more distant execution begins to feel. But for others, uncertainty becomes its own psychological burden. Because no inmate can say with certainty what California will do 10 years from now, or 20, or after the next election. That lingering possibility changes how many inmates think about time. Some stop counting years entirely. Others become consumed by legal procedure, studying appeals late into the night beneath dim cell lighting. Entire lives revolve around paperwork, transcripts, forensic reports, witness testimony, procedural motions. Thousands of pages can determine whether a conviction survives review. And occasionally, new evidence changes everything. Across the United States, DNA testing has overturned wrongful convictions in multiple criminal cases. Though such reversals are less common in capital punishment cases, the possibility remains powerful enough to shape national debate surrounding the death penalty. Supporters of capital punishment argue that decades of appeals already provide extraordinary legal safeguards. Critics argue that even one irreversible mistake makes execution too dangerous. San Quentin exists directly at the center of that argument. Because if California resumes executions, they will happen here. And if California abolishes capital punishment permanently, this prison's historic role changes forever. That unresolved future affects more than inmates alone. It shapes correctional staff as well. Officers assigned to death row operate inside one of the most scrutinized environments in American corrections. Every procedure is documented carefully. Every disciplinary incident may later appear inside court filings or public investigations. Professional distance becomes necessary for survival. Some veteran officers remember executions carried out decades earlier. They describe the process not as dramatic, but procedural. There were timelines, rehearsals, medical confirmations, security sweeps, witness coordination. Everything followed strict order. Nothing happened spontaneously. And even for officers trained to remain emotionally detached, the experience left lasting psychological effects. Now, younger correctional staff inherit responsibility for a system they may never actually see fully used. Yet they continue training for the possibility because California has never officially ended capital punishment. Policies change faster than prisons. That reality keeps the execution chamber relevant even in silence. But beyond politics and procedure lies a larger question that continues dividing California itself. What is the actual purpose of death row now? If executions remain paused indefinitely, is the sentence still meaningful? Or has death row become something else entirely? For decades, condemned inmates lived in near total isolation from the general prison population. Limited movement, minimal interaction, separate housing. The logic was partly security and partly tradition. But over time, legal challenges questioned whether automatic isolation based solely on a death sentence violated constitutional protections. Gradually, California began integrating some condemned inmates into broader prison programming. Certain inmates became eligible for work assignments. Others entered educational programs. A few worked in prison libraries or tutoring roles. Those changes created a strange contradiction. When a condemned inmate helps another prisoner learn to read, the atmosphere begins feeling less like an execution unit and more like a permanent prison community. And that shift complicates public understanding of punishment. Victims' advocacy groups often argue that commuting death sentences or loosening restrictions undermines decades of legal proceedings and jury decisions. Opponents of capital punishment argue that maintaining a system rarely used wastes enormous public resources while prolonging psychological suffering for everyone involved. Both sides believe they are defending justice, but they define justice differently. Some see justice as maintaining the harshest possible sentence for severe crimes. Others see justice as preventing irreversible state punishment altogether. Meanwhile, the prison itself continues operating in uncertainty. And nowhere is that uncertainty more visible than inside East Block at night. After final count clears, the building settles into near silence. Televisions flicker softly behind bars. Metal pipes creak through old walls. Fog rolls inward from the bay beyond the prison grounds. Some inmates read legal files beneath dim lights. Others stare at ceilings for hours, unable to sleep. Because on death row, nights tend to magnify thought. Some prisoners replay their crimes repeatedly. Others focus on appeals that may still remain possible. A few imagine futures they know they will never experience. And over time, the sentence reshapes identity itself. Not through physical violence, but through suspension. Waiting without resolution. Living inside a system that promises finality yet rarely delivers it. That may be San Quentin's most defining characteristic today. Not execution. Not rehabilitation. Indecision. California has paused executions for years, yet the state has never completely abandoned them. The chamber remains. The legal authority survives. Court battles continue. Political leadership changes. Public opinion evolves slowly. And inside the prison, condemned inmates continue waking each morning beneath a sentence that exists fully in law even if it no longer operates in practice. That contradiction affects everyone connected to the institution. Victims' families waiting for closure. Correctional officers maintaining procedures that may never be used again. Lawyers fighting appeals stretching across decades. And inmates living under sentences suspended between life and death. So why does San Quentin still execute inmates in California? The truthful answer is complicated. Right now it does not. But it still could. And until California permanently abolishes capital punishment or fully reinstates it, San Quentin will remain what it has always been, a prison built for finality, now defined by uncertainty, a place where the execution chamber waits quietly behind secured doors, a place where the sentence of death still exists even while time keeps moving forward. And as fog drifts across the bay outside those aging walls, the same question continues echoing through East Block night after night. Is the pause temporary? Or is this the beginning of the end for the death penalty in California?